When Sarah's grandmother passed away, the family gathered at the old house to handle the arrangements and sort through her belongings. The Victorian home was as grand as it was unsettling, with creaky wooden floors, heavy curtains that seemed to absorb light, and a peculiar coldness that lingered year-round. Sarah hadn't been there since she was a child, and stepping through the front door felt like entering a time capsule. "It hasn't changed a bit," she said, her voice echoing in the cavernous hallway. Her mother, Ellen, gave a tight-lipped smile. "That's how your grandmother liked it. She wasn't one for modernizing." As the family divided tasks, Sarah was assigned the attic. It was cluttered with trunks, old furniture, and boxes stacked so high they seemed on the verge of toppling. As she worked, she found a smaller, locked door, tucked into the far corner. She tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "What's in there?" she asked her mother later. Ellen's face darkened. "Nothing you need to worry about." That night Sarah couldn't sleep. The locked door nagged at her, a mystery begging to be solved. She'd always been curious by nature, and her mother's evasiveness only fueled her determination. As the house settled into silence, Sarah crept up to the attic with a flashlight and a set of lock-picking tools she'd bought on a whim during a phase of fascination with the escape rooms. It took longer than she expected, but the lock eventually clicked open. Inside, she found a small room, dusty and untouched. A single wooden chair sat in the center, its legs bolted to the floor. Chains hung from the walls, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. On a nearby shelf, Sarah found a leather-bound journal. She opened it carefully, the pages brittle with age. The first entry was dated 1952 and written in her grandmother's unmistakable handwriting. Journal entry, June 3rd, 1952. They told me it was a curse, passed down through generations. I didn't believe them at first, but I've seen the signs, the fits of rage, the whispers in the night. My mother tried to control it, and now it's my turn. I don't know how much longer I can keep this secret. Sarah's hands trembled as she turned the pages. The entries became more erratic, detailing strange occurrences and inexplicable events. Her grandmother wrote about a shadowy figure that appeared during family gatherings, invisible to everyone else. It whispered to her, urging her to do terrible things. By the time Sarah reached the final entry, she felt sick. Journal entry, September 15th, 1976. "I've done what I had to do. The room is secure. I pray no one ever opens it. If the curse remains dormant, perhaps the family will be safe. But if it's released, I don't want to think about what might happen." A loud creak snapped Sarah out of her thoughts. She turned to find her mother standing in the doorway, her face pale. "You shouldn't be in here," Ellen said, her voice trembling. "What is this?" Sarah demanded. "What curse? What did Grandma do?" Ellen sighed heavily and stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "It's not a curse," she said finally. "It's a condition. Something that's affected our family for generations. Your grandmother thought she could contain it, but she didn't fully understand it." "Contain what?" Sarah asked, her voice rising. Before Ellen could answer, the room seemed to grow colder. A faint whisper echoed, unintelligible but chilling. Ellen grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the door. "We need to leave, now." That night, Sarah's dreams were plagued by shadows and whispers. She woke several times, drenched in sweat, only to find the house unnervingly silent. By morning, she was determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. As the days passed, Sarah delved deeper into her family's history. She unearthed old records, letters, and photographs, piecing together a troubling narrative. The condition her mother spoke of seemed to manifest differently in each generation. For some it was violent outbursts, for others a descent into madness, but there were also stories of unnatural occurrences, objects moving on their own, apparitions, and unexplainable deaths. One night Sarah confronted her mother again. "Why didn't you tell me?" she demanded. "I have a right to know." Ellen hesitated. "I wanted to protect you," she said finally. Knowing wouldn't change anything. But Sarah couldn't let it go. She returned to the attic, determined to confront whatever secrets the room held. This time, she brought a video camera, hoping to capture proof of the phenomenon. As she stepped inside, the temperature plummeted. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The camera's screen flickered, static briefly obscuring the image. Then, in the corner of the room, a shadow began to take shape. Sarah froze, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The shadow moved toward her, its form shifting and writhing. She felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the very air was pressing down on her. "Leave!" a voice growled, low and guttural. Sarah stumbled backward, dropping the camera. She fled the room, slamming the door shut behind her. The next day, Ellen insisted they seal the room again. They replaced the padlock and boarded up the door. But Sarah knew it wasn't enough. The whispers followed her, growing louder with each passing day. Eventually, Sarah moved out of the house, but the shadows seemed to follow. Late at night, she would catch glimpses of movement in the corners of her vision, hear faint whispers just beyond her hearing. She knew the condition wasn't confined to the house. It was part of her now, a dark legacy she couldn't escape. Sarah's last act was to write her own journal, documenting everything she'd experienced. She hid it in the attic, hoping it might warn whoever came next. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't matter. The shadows wouldn't stop. They never stopped. When Julia's mother passed away, the family gathered to divide her belongings. Among the jewelry, furniture, and photo albums was a large wooden chest that Julia had never seen before. It was ornate, with intricate carvings of vines and leaves, and a heavy lock that required an antique key. Her father, Robert, looked uneasy as he handed her the key. "This is yours now," he said, his voice strained. "Your mother wanted you to have it." Julia hesitated. "What's inside?" Robert shook his head. "I don't know. Your mother was very secretive about it. She said it was a family heirloom, passed down for generations." Later that evening, Julia brought the chest home and set it in her living room. She turned the key in the lock, and it opened with a loud creak. Inside was a collection of old documents, photographs, and a smaller velvet-lined box. The box contained a delicate silver locket, tarnished with age. Julia opened the locket and found a miniature portrait of a young woman who looked strikingly familiar. The resemblance was uncanny. The woman had Julia's high cheekbones, her dark eyes, and even the small mole near her lip. A chill ran down her spine as she turned the locket over. Engraved on the back were the initials A.V. "Who are you?" Julia whispered. Over the next few days, Julia pored over the contents of the chest. The documents included letters, birth certificates, and newspaper clippings. One article caught her attention. It detailed the mysterious disappearance of Amelia Vaughn, a woman from her great-grandmother's generation. Amelia was last seen leaving her family's estate one stormy night. Witnesses claimed to have heard arguing, but no trace of her was ever found. The letters painted a darker picture. Amelia's correspondence with a man named Victor hinted at a forbidden romance. "Dearest Victor," one letter read, I cannot continue like this. The family's expectations are suffocating me, and I fear my brother's temper. I wish to escape, but I am terrified of what might happen if he discovers our plans. The last letter ended abruptly, with a smudge of ink as if it had been snatched from her hand, mid-sentence. Julia couldn't shake the feeling that Amelia's story was more than a tragic mystery. She showed the letters to her father, but he grew visibly upset. "I told your mother we should have destroyed that chest," he said. "Some secrets are better left buried." "But why?" Julia pressed. "What happened to Amelia?" Robert sighed heavily. Amelia's disappearance was the beginning of a curse. The Vaughn family has always had incidents, tragedies, misfortunes. Your grandmother believed it was because of what happened to Amelia. "What did happen to her?" Julia demanded. Robert shook his head. "No one knows for sure. But there are stories, rumors that her brother did something terrible and tried to cover it up. Whatever the truth is, it's best left alone." That night, Julia dreamed of a stormy night at a grand estate. She stood in a lavish parlor, watching as a man and woman argued heatedly. The man's face was blurred, but the woman was unmistakably Amelia. The argument grew louder, more violent, until the man grabbed a fireplace poker and swung it. Amelia crumpled to the floor, and the dream ended with Julia waking in a cold sweat. The next morning, Julia's unease deepened when she noticed the locket had moved from the chest to her nightstand. She hadn't put it there. She opened it again, and this time, the portrait seemed different. The woman's expression was no longer serene, but fearful. Julia decided to investigate further. She visited the old Vaughn estate, which had been abandoned for decades. The house was in ruins, overgrown with ivy and decay. Inside, she found remnants of its former grandeur: broken chandeliers, faded wallpaper, and a massive fireplace. As she explored, she felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners of her vision, and faint whispers filled the air. When she reached the parlor from her dream, she froze. The fireplace poker lay on the floor, rusted but unmistakably stained. A voice echoed in her mind. "You need to know the truth." Back home, Julia's dreams became more vivid. She saw Amelia's final moments over and over, each time with more detail. The brother's face became clearer, and Julia realized he bore a striking resemblance to her father. In the dreams, Amelia's spirit would turn to Julia and plead, "Set me free." Julia returned to the chest and found a letter she had overlooked. It was from Amelia's brother, confessing to his crime. He had killed Amelia in a fit of rage and buried her body on the estate grounds. The letter ended with a chilling line: "I have sealed my sin in that cursed locket. May it never be opened." Determined to end the torment, Julia drove back to the Vaughn estate. Guided by her dreams, she found a spot near an old oak tree and began digging. Hours later, she uncovered a skeletal hand clutching a tarnished silver locket identical to hers. She fell to her knees, overcome with emotion. The air grew cold, and a faint figure appeared before her. Amelia's spirit smiled sadly and whispered, "Thank you." Then she vanished. When Julia returned home, the chest and its contents had vanished, as if they had never existed. The locket on her nightstand was gone, too. For the first time in weeks, Julia felt at peace. But deep in the woods near the old estate, the wind carried a whisper. Some secrets should remain buried. The day after her grandmother's funeral, Claire stood in the old family home, a sprawling Victorian mansion that loomed over the sleepy neighborhood. The house, steeped in history and secrets, was now hers. But her inheritance came with a warning from her mother. Stay out of the basement. The warning, of course, only fueled Claire's curiosity. Why had her grandmother, a fiercely private woman, kept that part of the house locked and forbidden for decades? Even the memory of her grandmother's stern voice sent a shiver down Claire's spine. Nothing good comes from that place. Claire spent her first few days sorting through her grandmother's belongings. Among the faded photographs and antique furniture, she found a small iron key tucked into a jewelry box. The key was old and ornate, its purpose clear. It belonged to the basement door. Claire's fingers trembled as she turned the key in the lock. The door groaned open, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. A damp, musty smell wafted up, and the air felt heavier, as if the basement held its breath. The basement was vast, larger than she'd imagined. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars of preserved vegetables, dusty tools, and old crates. But one corner of the room caught her attention. There, behind a large wooden cabinet, was another door, smaller, more ominous. It had no handle, just a circular indentation at its center. Claire's heart raced as she examined it. The door seemed out of place, its surface smoother and colder than the rest of the basement. She ran her fingers along the indentation, feeling an odd vibration beneath her touch. Something about it felt alive. That night, Claire couldn't sleep. The strange door occupied her thoughts, filling her with a mix of dread and fascination. She decided to call her mother the next morning to ask about it. "Mom, what's behind the basement door?" she asked. Her mother's silence was deafening. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. "Claire, please, don't go near it. Promise me." "But why?" "Because it's dangerous," her mother said. "Your grandmother made us swear never to open it. She said it's a family burden we must carry. Leave it alone." Claire's curiosity only deepened. What could be so dangerous that her family had kept it hidden for generations? The next day, Claire returned to the basement. She brought a flashlight and a crowbar, determined to uncover the truth. As she pried at the circular indentation, the door suddenly released with a hiss, as if exhaling after years of restraint. It swung open slowly, revealing a narrow passageway. The air inside was icy, and the walls were lined with strange symbols etched into the stone. Claire's flashlight flickered as she stepped inside. The passage led to a small chamber, at the center of which stood a stone pedestal. On the pedestal was a black wooden box, its surface carved with more of the strange symbols. As she approached, Claire felt an overwhelming sense of unease. The box seemed to pulse, almost as if it had a heartbeat. Against her better judgment, she reached out and opened it. Inside was a single object, a small withered doll made of straw and fabric. Its button eyes stared blankly, and its stitched mouth seemed frozen in a silent scream. The room grew colder, and a low whisper filled the air, though Claire couldn't discern the words. That night, strange things began happening. Shadows moved on their own, and whispers echoed through the house. Claire woke to the sound of footsteps outside her bedroom, but when she opened the door, no one was there. The doll, which she had left in the basement, now sat on her nightstand. Terrified, Claire tried to get rid of it. She burned it in the fireplace, but the next morning it was back, unscathed, on the pedestal in the basement. Desperate, she called her mother again. When Claire described the doll, her mother's sobs filled the line. "It's real," her mother whispered. "Grandmother warned us, but I didn't believe her. That doll, it's cursed. It's tied to our family's blood. As long as it exists, it will haunt us." "What do I do?" Claire asked. tears streaming down her face. "You can't destroy it," her mother said, "but you can contain it. Seal the door and never open it again." Claire returned to the basement, determined to follow her mother's advice. She placed the doll back in the box and closed it. As she turned to leave, the whispers grew louder, forming words. "You can't escape." She hurried out, slamming the doors behind her and locking them with the iron key. She poured concrete over the basement door and vowed never to speak of it again. But the nightmares didn't stop. In her dreams, she saw the doll, its stitched mouth moving, whispering her name. And in the dead of night, she sometimes heard faint footsteps coming from beneath the floor. Claire realized the truth too late. The curse wasn't in the doll or the basement. It was in her blood, and no matter how far she ran, it would follow her. Years later, the house stood abandoned, a new layer of concrete sealing the basement door. But on quiet nights, passers-by claimed they could hear faint whispers coming from the old house, calling for someone to come and open the door once more. Mia inherited the house on Evergreen Street after her father's sudden passing. The home, a modest two-story colonial, was unassuming but carried an air of melancholy. Her father had lived there alone for years after her mother's disappearance, a mystery that had haunted the family. While sorting through her father's belongings, Mia discovered a leather-bound journal hidden in a false drawer of his desk. The cover was a deep crimson, worn with age. Inside were pages filled with her father's spidery handwriting, recounting stories about the family's dark past. The first entries were innocuous, detailing mundane aspects of her father's life. But as Mia read on, the tone shifted. He wrote about her mother's disappearance, blaming it on a family curse. According to the journal, their family had a pact with an entity her father referred to only as the Shadow. The pact, made generations ago, promised wealth and protection in exchange for occasional sacrifices. Her father claimed the entity had taken her mother as payment for a debt left unpaid by his parents. Mia's stomach churned. She'd always dismissed her father's mutterings about curses and shadows as the ramblings of an old man burdened by grief. But the journal's vivid descriptions and detailed accounts made her question everything. That night, Mia dreamed of her mother. She was standing at the foot of Mia's bed, her eyes hollow and her face gaunt. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. When Mia woke, her room was freezing, and the journal lay open on her nightstand, though she'd left it on the desk downstairs. The page it displayed was blank, except for a single sentence scrawled in fresh ink. "Find the mirror." Mia spent the next day searching the house. Her father's journal mentioned an old mirror kept in the attic, described as the conduit through which the Shadow communicated with their family. She found it tucked behind a stack of boxes, its ornate frame tarnished and its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. When she wiped it clean, her reflection shimmered unnaturally, as though the glass were water. As she stared, the surface rippled, and another face appeared, her mother's. Mia stumbled back, her breath hitching. "Mom?" she whispered. Her mother's lips moved, and this time, Mia heard the words, "Help me." Mia spent the following days consumed by the journal and the mirror. Her father had written about a ritual to sever the family's connection to the Shadow, but it came with a warning. Failure would result in a fate worse than death. The ritual required specific items: a silver knife, a vial of salt water, and a lock of her own hair. The final step was to confront the Shadow and demand her mother's release. Mia's hands trembled as she gathered the materials. She set up the mirror in her living room, lighting candles around it as described in the journal. The house grew eerily silent, as if holding its breath. When Mia recited the incantation, the mirror's surface turned pitch black. Then the air became heavy, and a deep voice echoed through the room. "You dare summon me?" it boomed. Mia steeled herself. "Release my mother." Laughter filled the air, low and menacing. "A bold demand," the voice said. "But this bond is not easily broken. What will you offer in return?" Mia hesitated. She hadn't considered this possibility. "Take me instead," she blurted, tears streaming down her face. The room fell silent. The voice finally replied, "Very well." The mirror's surface rippled, and her mother's face appeared once more. She reached out, and Mia felt a cold hand grasp hers. Her mother stepped through the glass, collapsing into Mia's arms. But Mia's relief was short-lived. The candles extinguished simultaneously, plunging the room into darkness. When the lights flickered back on, Mia was gone. The mirror stood shattered, its shards reflecting only shadows. Her mother, now free, clutched the journal tightly. It had been decades since she'd felt the warmth of sunlight, and though guilt gnawed at her, she knew she couldn't let Mia's sacrifice be in vain. She sealed the mirror's frame with salt and buried it deep in the woods, hoping to end the family's curse once and for all. But sometimes in the dead of night, she swore she could hear Mia's voice calling to her from the darkness, trapped in a realm she'd never escape.